whose work I admire. But anyway, like you said, I'm pretty much stuck in China by fear of quarantine if I ever go out and come back. So anyway, let me start. Okay, so I will, in this talk, I will mostly focus on a few composers, and those are not usually associated with algorithmic composition or, to put it bluntly, computer composition. Admittedly, I could have chosen others, as there have been many attempts at trying to harness the power of computers to simulate the operations of composing music, that is, of encoding in a programming language the whole of a musical thought. However, Peter Zinoviev, Joel Chatterby, Giuseppe Englert, the three, among others I will discuss, are, for me, not only wonderful memories, but also they represent steps in using computers in various states of musical representation. They are stepping stones in the development of computer music in the 1960s and 70s. To those, I will add someone experimenting in Japan today, Suguru Goto. In this talk, I tried to detect the philosophical root as the organizers of this study session put in their introduction, or rather, the motivations or the expectations of those I will mention. Along the way, I will allude to other pioneers, some of whom are well known, such as Jerry Hiller, Xenakis, Barbo, Koenig, Pietro Grossi, let me correct this here, or to a lesser degree, Louis and Bibi Baron, and some of which are less so, such as Harry Olson, Giuseppe Englert, Matsumoto
Professor
Inoharu.
May I just interrupt? Sorry, may I just interrupt you? Because you have, I think, again, opened the presentation mode of the PowerPoint, but I don't know why in the presentation mode of the PowerPoint we don't actually see the presentation. So it would be better to get back to the non-presentation mode of the PowerPoint if it is possible.
It is in non-presentation mode.
Yeah. It is better in a non-presentation mode because we actually just see a very long and tiny white page. I don't know why, but if you get out from the presentation mode, maybe it can be better.
Yeah, hi Mark, Laura Zatra. We are seeing a blank page, white page now.
Well, I am not in presentation mode. What about that?
Yeah.
Yes, that is better.
Yes. Thank you.
Here
That
we
is
can
better.
see everything. I don't know why, but it works better.
Yeah, me neither.
Sorry.
The thing is, I pretty much wrote everything I'm going to say on the screen because of this Zoom session. All right, so anyway, I was saying that then I will allude to other pioneers and many others like Herbert Brun, David Cope, Michael Kowalski, Otto Lasker, who's been mentioned already, John Melby, André Riot, Gerald Strang, and many others should also be studied. Even the algorithmic processes used by Magnus Lindberg, Kaya Sariao or Philippe Manoury, to name a few, lack proper documentation, except on the occasion of lectures by those composers themselves. It appears that the history of the computer simulation of musical composition remains to be written. If there are several papers on computational musicology, starting with Hiller, in fact, little has been written on computational composition in a comprehensive manner. So I'll start at the late 1940s. Louis and Bibi Baron established their studio in their apartment in New York City in 1949. From the onset, they were influenced by early cybernetics as presented in Norbert Winier's book, Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, published in 1948. Their friend, writer Anaïs Nin, talks about them in the early 50s. The front room of their apartment on 8th Street is completely filled with equipment. It's a jungle of electronic instruments, knobs, wires, as complex as the control panel of an airplane. Their soundtrack for Forbidden Planet, Hollywood 1956, is well known, but I'd like to play an excerpt from an earlier work created for Ian Hugo's films Belle of Atlantis in 1952. In that film, we can hear how the Barons built circuits that generated electronic sequences, or, as their music was later called, electronic tonalities.
I think we don't hear the sound. We heard just a couple of sounds. I don't know if there is.
You don't hear the sound.
No, probably you have to put it in presentation mode. No? You have to share the sound.
I do. I did.
On the top.
Yeah.
No, you have what to stop sharing the just.
Okay, what about that now? Does that work?
Yes.
My first vision of Earth was water-veiled.
What we have is, this is an excerpt from the book by Anaïs Nin. What we have is a new artistic tool, direct communication by pure emotion rather than by a symbol which must be retranslated in the mind. In studying the communication or information theory, how much information can be communicated from one mind to another or one machine to another? Oh, sure, I said, cybernetics. It was a wild guess. Precisely, Louis agreed. Well, science has been borrowing from nature and the arts to prove its theories, So why shouldn't artists borrow the tools of science to express emotional ideas? What is evolving is a new form of art, completely electronic. Despite the fact that the barons were influenced by Wiener's book on cybernetics, they relied more on building electronic circuits than trying to model human compositional activity. Their circuits did not emulate known rules for composing and thus did not attempt at simulating human behaviors through artificial means. Instead, they built circuits that were autonomous. They created sound sequences with little or no musician's control. The art was in conceiving the circuits. And of course, the barons added tape delays very heavily, as can be heard. Wiener's book insisted on mathematical formalization of human and animal behaviors, where the notion of feedback had a very big importance. Baron's electronic circuits tried to follow Wiener's ideas, but they led elsewhere. Their construction would generate whole sound sequences by themselves without any form of constraints, except from the structure of the circuits themselves. In addition, the barons altered the functioning through potentiometers in an interactive fashion. This is how they put it. We design and construct electronic circuits which function electronically in a manner remarkably similar to the way that lower life forms function psychologically. I will now turn to another episode. That one took place a few years later. Harry Olson was the developer, along with Herbert Billar, of the RCA synthesizers in the 1950s at Bell Labs in New Jersey. Even though the RCA Mark II was made famous by the pieces of Milton Babbitt and, to a lesser degree, Charles Wuorinen, both of whom encoded finished compositions, Olson alluded to his synthesizer to be used to compose music. For this, he relied on the use of Markov chains without naming them, and like so many others, on the generation of random numbers to trigger the processes. We only have a description of his ideas in his 1952 book, Musical Engineering, later published under the title Music, Physics, and Engineering. Now, this is a diagram of his composing system. We have no musical realization of Olson ideas. It's only on paper. However, it's often the case in the 20th century that artists and engineers dreams of new ways of creating sounds without actually implementing their ideas, and this is such a case. Now, in the 1967 reprint of his book, Olson added, "A process and technique has been developed for writing music by means of a digital computer. In this process, random integers considered to be equivalent to musical notes are first generated and then selected and screened by mathematical operations which express the rules of musical composition." Here, he derived from his 1952 ideas of having the synthesizer produce sequences of sounds through Markov chains, as he mentioned the formalization of compositional rules. This is something that Jerry Hiller had clearly used in the 1956-1957 string quartet in 4 parts and documented in his subsequent book from 1959. While Hiller, in his Iliac Suite for string quartet, based the algorithmic composition on sets of musical rules, he expressed a more general view in a statement from that 1959 book. So, Hiller, it is a feature of digital computers that they can be efficiently used to create a random universe and to select ordered set of information from this random universe in accordance with imposed rules, musical or otherwise. Now, this very general perspective was indeed applied by Xenakis in his early experiment with computers ST10 and ST4. The name of the program, ST, stands for stochastic, of course, and 1 for version 1, and it was generated on February 8, 1962. The computer was an IBM installed in Paris, and the program was written in Fortran. The main algorithm was an implementation of the Poisson law of distribution, which controlled the production of rare events. In a particular pitch, in a given octave, if a particular pitch appears, its reoccurrence in a given time interval will obey the Poisson distribution. Its use as a main structuring guide of musical events led Pierre Barbeau, another pioneer, to comment, "This was to forget that music must unite various sounds before taking into consideration the fact that they are likely to accumulate or become rare, to appear in the treble or in the bass, to last a long time or to disappear as soon as they appear, to be strong or weak, in short, to have this or that character and to exist in an anarchic way instead of being subject to the laws of a coherent coexistence." By the way, there was a question yesterday about terminology. It was Pierre Barbeau who introduced the expression musique algorithmique in an article for Esprit, a French journal which published quite a few papers by avant-garde artists. Before that, in 1959, he spoke of musique cybernétique, and later he mentioned composition musicale automatique. Now let's stay in Europe a little longer. Still in the 1960s, Peter Zinoviev established a computer music studio in his private home in London. Eventually, his studio, by the end of the 60s, listed 2 computers, a PDP-8E with 28K 12-bit words, and a PDP-8L, much faster, with 8K words. And there was storage provided by some external devices, a disk and deck tapes. The software was custom made by a programmer, Peter Grogono, who later went to Montreal. It was a hybrid system. So the DACs generated control voltages for a bank, or actually banks, there were 2 banks, of analog devices, 1 bank of generators, 1 bank of filters, built for the studio by David Cockrell. And later it was hooked up to a larger Synthi 100. This is a photo of his studio with the computers and the Synthi 100. So he first acquired a PDP 8S in 1967, and soon after he got a second computer, PDP-8L. Now, the software was written by Peter Grogonow, Musis, and I'm going to play an excerpt from the first piece which came out of that system. There was a piece composed by Alan Sutcliffe, who's an electronic arts pioneer and a software engineer and artist, and Zinoviev. And this took place in August 1968 at the Congress of the International Federation for Information Processing, IFIP, in Edinburgh. This is when Sutcliffe founded the Computer Arts Society. During that meeting, Xenakis received a first prize for his string quartet, ST4, which actually was played from a phonograph. The composition by Zinoviev and Sutcliffe followed and received the second prize. The piece, called ZASP, was the result of a collaboration between Sutcliffe and Zinoviev. The former had produced a result on his computer, an ICL, that's a British machine, ICL 1900, which he could use in this company where he worked. And the output of the program was encoded on a punched paper and which was fed into the PDP-8S, which was controlling by hybrid synthesis the oscillators. So this is an excerpt from that piece. So this is how Michael Kessler reviewed that piece at this event. On first hearing, I conceived the resulting composition as a succession of discrete stimuli drawn from a limited set of timbres and did not apprehend any larger scale structure. And he added a piece of advice: extensive psychological research needs to be done on the way that orally novel events are organized conceptually into larger units. Now, what's extraordinary was a concert in January 1968 at the Queen Elizabeth Hall in London, where Zinoviev presented a piece, again with the PDP controlling the bank of oscillators. The computer plays by itself. So this is the introduction by Tristram Carey, a colleague of Zinoviev who started the EMS company with him. And then we'll see Zinoviev starting the computer and leaving the stage.
The next item, Partita for Unattended Computer by Peter Zinoviev, is a true live performance in the sense that no magnetic tape is being used at all. Furthermore, the computer has a choice at various stages in the procedure, and the piece therefore comes out different every time it's played. The performance you're about to hear is therefore unique and unrepeatable. First of all, checks are made to see that the composition is correctly loaded into the computer. The computer is started and will carry out the performance unattended.
The audience is a capacity one, but the computer's performance didn't meet with universal approval. The Financial Times said, technically, it may be a triumph of skill and knowledge, but what we heard resembled the dreariest kind of neo-Webern drawn out to inordinate length.
Yeah, neo-Webern, that was the Financial Times. The main document left by Zinoviev about his computer experiments can be found in the first issue of the Sonology Institute at Utrecht, Electronic Music Reports in 1969. This is how he describes his approach to using the computer. There is a strong temptation in using this equipment not to program the computer merely to sequence a series of numbers, all of which have been predetermined and stored. It is satisfactory to let the computer make some choices at different levels. Progressively, those isolated endeavors found an echo chamber in the nascent field of what become known as digital humanities. That field started to take shape in the 1960s. In 1966, computers and the humanities, a newsletter, was founded by a professor of English in New York, Joseph Rabin. Here is how Rabin defined the field. We define humanities as broadly as possible. Our interests include literature of all times and countries, music, the visual arts, folklore, the non-mathematical aspects of linguistics, and all phases of the social sciences that stress the humane. A section of the publication became a source of information for all sorts of application of computers to humanities fields, including, of course, music. It was called Directory of Scholars Active, and it was divided by individual fields, one of them being music. It is a testimony of the multiform activities in music and musicology with computers at the time, the birth of digital humanities. This is an example from that newsletter. There are plenty. Usually you have between 3 to 5 or 6 abstracts about music in each issue. Another striking example, or landmark actually, was the exhibition set up in London by Jazia Reichardt, Cybernetic Serendipity. It was seen by over 60,000 visitors. Its catalog, which now is on the web, is a masterpiece of documentation of what artists, composers, poets did with computers in the 1960s. It was so significant that an exhibition took place 8 years ago, entirely devoted to the 1968 exhibition. That's an exhibition of an exhibition. Now, in the 1970s, I'm going to talk about Giuseppe Englert, a Swiss composer living in France. Instead of following the path of Hiller, Xenakis, or Barbeau and using the computer for composition, Englert turned towards interactive control of processes. At a time when such approach was seriously hampered by the lack of a powerful real-time digital system. This indeed makes him a computer music pioneer. Later, after having been one of the first to introduce the synclavier in France, he developed software for controlling network of processes. During the time Englert used a computer, that is from the mid-70s until the year 2000, he experimented with algorithmic compositions, interactive ones. In each of his pieces, Englert defined a set of rules comprising constraints and processes. Some constraints were negative, what not to do, and other were positive, what's possible. Around 1975, the group of artists and musicians at the University of Paris 8, the GAIV, obtained one of the first commercial microcomputers, an Intellect 8, which was not actually sold to the public. A couple of technicians of the group built digital to analog converters, DACs. Those were then connected to analog synthesizers, which were EMS VCS3s. The Intellect would compute control voltages then applied to the VCO, the VCA, the VCF of the synthesizer. These are a couple of photos of the setup. In his approach to algorithmic composition, Englert dealt with processes. For him, a process has been defined as a set of rules able to producing either a result or another process able to producing either a result or another process. And he concludes by saying a compositional process is a subsystem related to a particular economy in respect of a particular set of constraints. In Girolles et autres champignons, 1977, the initial program generates its own modification as it goes along, creating unexpected sequences. Here, a process uses its departure state to generate new structures, hence modifying itself. The piece was realized on the hybrid system, the Intellect 8, hooked to a couple of VCA3 through 12 DACs. This is then Englert acquired in 1979, one of the first synclavier, and this was driven by software written in XPL, which is a sort of, it's a flavor of Algol. So I'm going to play an example of that piece, Sopra la Girolmetta. That's another example of the interactive approach to algorithmic composition by Englert. He used a program written by Vincent Lesbos, Metro 3, linked through MIDI to a Yamaha TX816. So that was after the synclavier, actually. When with Metro 3, sequences are played on 8 channels. Each sequence is individually controlled and obey commands from the interface. Thus, the performance is interactive in that the musician sets and changes the values which define the sequences at will. Its way of function is loosely inspired by the traditional English change ringing, but it does not sound like it when heard. So this is an example of that piece. I'm going to talk about Joel Chadabé now because he's known for his enduring work on documenting the history of electronic music in the world, but he was also a pioneer of interactive music. He based most of his work on interacting with a system that would generate audio sequences. He started in the 60s, in the late 60s, with a very, very large Moog module system he called the Coordinated Electronic Music Studio. And already in his 1971 piece, Ideas of Movement at Bolton Landing, he interacted with that system through handles. They changed the clock driving the sequencers. I'm going to quote myself, I'm sorry. I first met him when in 1978, I co-organized with Barry Trax a UNESCO-sponsored computer music workshop and conference in Aarhus, Denmark. Chadabé had made the trip from New York, and this was where he presented his piece for 2 theremin antennas solo, which I'm going to play an excerpt. He had just acquired the very first commercial synclavier from that small Vermont company, New England Digital Corporation. At that time, this was a microcomputer driving a bank of 16 sine wave oscillators arranged in a frequency modulation configuration. The device had to be programmed using XPL, derivative from algo. And this particularly suited Chadabé as he could write programs that generated music. Because the system operated in real time, Chadabé could interact with the synclavier. Robert Moog built for him a couple of antennas on the same principle as the theremin. With the left hand one, he acted upon the tempo at which the synclavier generated events. The right hand one was used to change the software patches for a variety of timbres. Here's an excerpt. Later, Chadabé changed his system twice. First, he used a Macintosh and Yamaha FM modules with dedicated software, or the M program devised by David Ziccarelli. Then he switched to a more powerful and versatile system, the Kima software, with the Pacarana DSP, all the while continuing to produce pieces where he would interact with what the machine was computing. His intention then was to reintroduce the notion of composer-performer in an algorithmic environment, the human agent being able to interact with the software. In Japan, I wanted to mention this composer Matsumoto Inoharu. He was using the technology of his time in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, and he wrote programs to compose fragments of a piece. In some cases, the software would compute in real time and send control voltages through MIDI, through digital to analog conversions, and then also directly MIDI messages. So it was a very complex system. And in Le Premier Oiseau, the computer acts as a virtual performer, which produces a response to the performer, to the human performer. It is a form of computer-assisted performance. And contrary to others who give the machines degrees of freedom in creating strings of musical sounds, Matsumoto insists on the human aspect of what is produced. Using the computer is intended to evoke the presence of a shadow performer. His intention is to express the levels of movement of the human heart in an organically integrated way through the use of a computer. Also from Japan, I will conclude this presentation with an example from Suguro Goto. He's now a faculty member of Tokyo Gedai, Tokyo University of Arts and Music. Before that, he spent over 10 years in France, where he had connections to IRCAM. He is well versed in all computer music software like Super Collider, Open Music, C-Sound, Max, and others. And he wrote a book, Emprise, published in 2016, where he describes many different approaches and techniques for computer music, including, of course, his own interactive composer-performer practices. About his piece, Duali 2 for Recorder and String Quartet, 2019, he declares, composing with AI, or strictly speaking, having someone compose instead of you, contrasts with the act of thinking intentionally with the human brain. So I thought about that and about what AI can do by giving the priority to the things that human cannot do. So let's hear an example of that piece. Now, Marco Stropa mentioned yesterday afternoon this book of uneven equality. Some chapters are outstanding and some others not so much. The highly uneven quality of this publication regrettably points towards the need to reevaluate the issue. For one, the title poses problems, as underlined by Marco yesterday. Algorithmic music is used in that book in lieu of different approaches like computer-assisted composition. Strangely, Pierre Barbeau is mentioned nowhere in that book. Neither is Stropa, Englert, Zinoviev, Sugurugoto, and many others. This points towards publishing accounts that would paint a more complete landscape. Today, software tools like Patchwork Musical Constraints or Open Music offer powerful means for computer-assisted composition. They also are used for computational musicology, in particular for music analysis. Other software environments like Max or Super Collider can and are used for computer-assisted composition. In any case, it appears that the history of the computer simulation of musical composition remains to be written. And this symposium is an excellent step towards this goal. So, to conclude, I'd like to express the hope that the various communication can be gathered and published somehow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. I open immediately the discussion. If there is this rich and historical presentation, where I have also to say some of the names like Englert, I didn't know too, so I'm quite ignorant. I must admit, Giuseppe Englert, I had never heard his music, and so thank you very much for this rich presentation on the origins. There is a question from Laura.
Hi, Mark. Just a comment, actually. Thank you for sharing with us new names or misrepresented names and composers, such as Peter Zinoviev. Of course, he's so important, and Peter Zinoviev started to be recognized a few years ago with your work or with works and articles by James Gardner, for example, and or during the AHEM conference in London, the alternative histories of electroacoustic music. So it's important actually to include, like Zana's presentation yesterday, to include these new names, these new approaches, and these persons who did a lot for musical assisted composition. So mine is just a comment on your willingness to include these names also from not always Western countries, but always also from Asian countries. So thank you.
Well, thank you for your comment, Laura. The thing I tried to do, and that needs to be further developed, is to try to understand what motivated those pioneers, like you said, who are not known for those I picked, and what was their much. So the initial ideas they had maybe in the 60s or in the 70s, they continued developing them, even though the technology changed. But what were those ideas? What were their expectations? What were their dreams? So it's not easy because most of them are now gone, like Chalamet and Zinoviev and Englert. But we have some writings, and we have to go through the writings and try to find traces of what their expectations were.
Yes, hello, my name is Agostino Di Scipio, and I was curious to ask you, you defined your nice contribution today as a contribution to the history of, I quote, the simulation of musical composition by computers. And I'm curious to ask you if you want to say more about why you insist on the simulation of, on this word in particular. Why you speak of simulating, not just composing with computers?
Because that word simulation that I'm using in my talk was actually given to me by the pioneers which I have studied particularly. They did try to create systems, either analog in the case of the barons, or digital later, which would simulate a composition activity. I don't say a human activity, but a composition activity. And in some cases, and this is what Suguro Goto is saying at the end, those experiments diverged from what humans could do. Suguro Goto is very much interested in robots and non-human activities. In fact, he's himself a performer, and he also creates costumes for dancers which look like robots in many ways. So this simulation is a simulation of musical activity, but not a simulation of human activity. I don't know if that answers your point, but
I don't know. Just that I was asking myself: was Koenig simulating? Was Barbeau simulating his composition, or were they just composing?
Well, I did not include Barbeau because Barbeau is more known, and Barbeau has published several books, and some books came out not long ago. But Barbeau was trying to, a little like Hiller, to create music by formalizing rules of composing. So it's not as experimental as Xenakis, for instance.
Okay. Other. May I just pose you another question? Do you think, because Laura before said what you're doing is writing a broader and more complex idea of history of computer-assisted composition, and this is true. But would it be possible then to write a history of computer-assisted composition? Because if I also think, for example, at Italy, I've studied, for example, the case of Turin, and we have names like Walter Olmo, who is mostly unknown, but in the late 50s began composing, and also in the circle, not Zafir himself, but in the circle around him, there were artists who started using computer in the 60s, trying to compose something that I still don't know. I have too many. So would then be possible to I think it is crucial, the idea of understanding ideas behind this, because so you don't have just the name as the pioneer, as the initiator, but you have an environment that where all ideas circulate in somehow. So you try to abstract these ideas in somehow. But then, could it be possible then to write a history? Would you think that a goal in 10 years to write a complete history of the origins of computer-aided composition as a possible goal? Just a curiosity.
I hope we can do it sooner than 10 years.
Okay.
But you in Italy, of course, you have people like Pietro Grossi, who's quite famous, but you have people like Walter Branchi, who's not so famous, and it would be very interesting to see what he was doing in the 70s and when I met him. And this task could be done, little by little. I agree with you that it's an enormous task, but it depends on the standpoint we have, on the view we have, on the musicological view we have of the issue. And like you said, it's not a question of documenting the fact, but also mostly the ideas. So yes, I think it can be done.
Great. So with this task, I close now your presentation because we have the coffee. But I thank you very, very much for this really rich presentation and for your presence. It was great.
Okay.